This is slide 5 in our Reconstruction unit, Fighting Back. If you'll recall, in our last slide, we talked about Congress forcing its views on the South. Well, the South is not simply going to just take this lying down. They are going to fight back. And one of the ways that they do that is through forming these secret organizations to terrorize people. Those organizations are known as the Ku Klux Klan. Okay, the KKK is the most well-known of them. Southern whites were as angry at carpetbaggers and scalawags as they were at blacks. So these secret organizations were formed to terrorize the carpetbaggers, the scalawags, blacks, and so forth. The KKK was formed in Tennessee in 1866 by former Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest. Yes, this is who Forrest Gump is named after, if you're familiar with the movie. Nathan Bedford Forrest, former cavalry commander for the Confederacy, probably their best. A lot of Confederate war veterans don't believe the war is over, and this is how they're going to continue to fight it, through organizations such as the KKK. One of the main jobs of the Klan was to intimidate blacks and prevent them from voting. Now, intimidation is extremely illegal. Using violence to threaten blacks to prevent them from voting is extremely illegal. However, there were legal ways to intimidate voters. And we're going to mention two of them. Okay? The first was a literacy test. You had to prove that you could read or write or had a basic knowledge of U.S. government and civics before you were allowed to vote. So if you were a black man on election day, you went to your polling place to vote. There's a white guy there working the place. He says, "What are you doing here?" And you say, "Well, I'm here to vote." And he'd say, "Oh, really? Well, then you need to sign your name right here." And you'd say, "Well, I don't know how to write. I never learned how to write." And he'd say, "Oh, that's a shame. You don't get to vote today." Or he'd say, "Here, well, read this document. You got to prove you can read." And they'd say, "Well, I don't know how to read." "Oh, well, you don't get to vote today." Or if you did know how to read and write, once you got inside, they would ask you random, inane questions that you couldn't possibly know the answer to. And if you didn't know the answer, you didn't get to vote. Right? Now, if you were a poor white man, and you're voting for the right guy here, they found ways around it. They'd say, "Oh, well, listen, when you go in there, they're going to hand you a piece of paper and say, 'Read this. Here's what it says,'" right? And you'd say what the guy outside told you to say. Or he'd say, "Well, when you go in, they're going to ask you some questions. Here's the answers." And they'd tell you the answers, but nobody's telling the black guy the answers. Okay? So those are called literacy tests, and they're perfectly legal. Right? Because you're not telling the black man he can't vote because he's black. You're telling him he can't vote because he can't read or write. Okay? And that's the loophole. That's the way around the law. Because according to the 15th Amendment, you could not prevent someone from voting based on their race or previous servitude, meaning if they had been a servant or a slave before. But you're not telling him he can't vote because he's black or because he used to be a slave. You're telling him he can't vote because he can't read or write. Okay? Now, the second means of legal intimidation here was a poll tax. Okay? You had to pay a tax before you could vote. Okay? So you'd go to vote, and you'd say, "I'm here to vote," and they'd say, "Oh, well, you are. Well, you got your 25 cents, right? You got to pay your tax." And the black man would say, "No, I don't have any money." "Oh, that's a shame. You don't get to vote today." So, and again, a white guy shows up, it's fine. They, before you go in, they say, "Look, here's 25 cents. Give it to the guy inside." And nobody's helping the black guy though. And both of them, again, perfectly legal means, literacy tests and poll taxes. Okay? Now, President Johnson continually vetoed all of Congress's acts here. So Congress tries to get rid of President Johnson. And the way they're going to do it is through impeachment. Now let's look at this whole little process here. Okay? First, we have to start with something called the Tenure of Office Act. Okay? Tenure of Office Act. According to the Constitution, okay, Congress has to approve a president's choices for cabinet secretary, like, Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, all of that. Congress has to approve those men before they get the job. Okay? Well, Congress passed a law that was called the Tenure of Office Act. And it said Congress also has to approve the president firing a cabinet secretary. Not just hiring, but also firing. Okay? Johnson, however, believes that the Tenure of Office Act is illegal. It's unconstitutional. So he decides he's going to challenge this. He's going to see just how far the law will let him go. Okay? So Johnson decides he's going to fire the Secretary of War, a man named Edwin Stanton. Okay? Now, Stanton was a leftover from Lincoln's cabinet. Okay? And Congress had gone to Stanton and said, we'd like you to spy on President Johnson for us. Let us know what he's up to, what he's planning next, and so forth. Johnson finds out about it, decides he doesn't like Stanton anymore, and he's going to get rid of him. So Johnson fires the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. The problem is he's now broken the Tenure of Office Act. So Congress believes they've got him, and they're going to impeach the president. Okay? Now, let's clear up a misunderstanding here. Many of you, what does impeachment mean? Think about it. Tick, 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 ding. Time's up. You probably think impeachment means to remove a president from office. It does not. Let's clear up that misconception. Impeachment simply means bringing a president to trial, charging him with a crime, and bringing him to trial. He may be found guilty, he may be found not guilty. But impeaching simply means putting the president or any elected official, but we'll use president here, on trial for a crime. They charge President Johnson with violating the Tenure of Office Act, firing a cabinet secretary without Congress's approval. Okay? Now, here's how an impeachment works. The House of Representatives looks at all the evidence, and the House then has a vote to decide, yes, there's enough evidence to send it to a trial, or no, there's not enough evidence. In this case, the House decides, yes, we have enough evidence to send this to a trial, to at least ask the question, is he guilty or not? Then once the House has done that, the Senate acts as judge and jury. The Senate runs the hearing. And then the senators vote guilty or not guilty. You need a 2/3 majority to vote guilty for a president to be removed from office. 2/3 majority, okay, to vote guilty. By the time this impeachment hearing is over and the voting is done, the radical Republicans failed to get rid of President Johnson by one vote. They were one vote short of their 2/3 majority. They needed 36 guilty votes. They got 35. 7 Republicans actually voted not guilty because they believed the president had not broken a law, that the Tenure of Office Act was indeed unconstitutional, which was Johnson's argument all along. So, their plot to get rid of President Johnson fails, President Johnson will serve out the remainder of his term and continue to be a thorn in Congress's side.